Hello and welcome to this video tutorial for the Hairst Hap Hood. In this video I am covering some of the techniques that are used in this project. Not everything is covered, but anything that seems a little trickier I tried to include to hopefully help you out as you work this project. There are a couple of things you can add on to the Hairst Hap Hood, which include doing a purled I-cord bind off around the front of the hood and also adding on a little bit of lace. So let's get started. Okay, so here I'm going to show you how you're starting the Hairst Hap Hood. It actually starts the same way that you would start a traditional Shetland hap using the modern method, which is where you start from the center and work your way out. So if you've made a hap in that way, then this will be familiar to you. But I figured it would be easier to have it all in one video. And this part, if you haven't done it before, can be a little confusing just at the start. So in the pattern, you'll be instructed to make a slip knot and put it on the needle as the first stitch. So you'll go ahead and do that. And then we are making yarn overs at the beginning of every row. And making yarn over at the beginning of a row feels like a slightly odd thing to do. So that's why I'm demonstrating it. You are literally going to let the working yarn sit on top of your right hand needle. And I tend to just hold it in place with my index finger here. Then you're going to go into the stitch on the needle. The yarn will get caught around the right hand needle as you knit that first stitch, and then you have technically 2 stitches on your needle. So that is your first row. You'll be instructed to turn the work. Again, that can feel confusing because there's hardly anything on your needles at the start, but every row is going to start with that same yarn over. So again, just let the working yarn sit on top of the right hand needle. So you don't want to scoop it like this and do a full wrap. That will give you an extra stitch, but what happens with that is it tends to make the yarn over loop sit too tightly to the work. So you literally just let it sit over the right hand needle and then go into the first stitch and knit it. On this next row here that we're working, the last stitch of the row you will knit through the back leg. And that is because it was the yarn over you made on the previous row, and it just ever so slightly tightens it up. So from here on out, as you're working that triangle shape, you'll start every row with the yarn over at the beginning. You'll be knitting all of the stitches on the needle because we're working in garter stitch, and then the last stitch of every row you'll go through the back leg because it will be the yarn over that you have made on the previous row. So you can just see the start of the triangle, and we want to be able to see these yarn over loops sticking out the side. So you'll just keep working in this way until however many stitches you're instructed to in the pattern. And as you continue to work, you'll start to see this triangular garter stitch shape showing up on the needles. And for those of you who hold your yarn in the left hand, which I don't tend to do, so this will be an awkward demonstration, but if you are holding it in your left hand, then you literally just want to scoop the yarn like this before bringing the needle forward and then knitting that stitch. So that would be how you would work your yarn over loop at the beginning if you were holding the yarn in your left hand. And just to show a few more rows worked, this is what your triangle should be looking like. These nice visible yarn over loops down each side. Okay, so I didn't do a separate detailed video of how you work the front neck shaping, but just to quickly explain how that goes, you will have done your triangle shapes, you will have just finished that, and you'll work up to the required number of stitches as per the pattern. Then as you work across the next row, you'll bind off a certain number of front neck stitches here. Our hood is joined, so you can't exactly see that there, but when you do that bind off row, you'll then have two separate sets of stitches for each front shoulder here, and they will get worked separately with short rows to shape them. So that happens on both sides of the front. For the back, you make the same triangle shape, again starting at the point and working out the way, and then you work all the way up to the top of the back neck in this case, but you will also be working the short rows to match the shaping on the front. And if I open this up, you can kind of see this short row shaping here. Then these get joined with a 3-needle bind off on both sides. Then you'll be on to picking up your stitches for working the hood. So for this project, we are starting sort of in the center of the front neck shaping here in these bound off stitches. So in the pattern, you'll be told to find the center of the bound off stitches, but then to move a couple of stitches over to the right to start the pickup. Because the hood is actually, at the front, is going to be ever so slightly overlapped. So you can go ahead and, count those stitches and find out exactly where the center is. Or, you could just fold it in half like this, find the center there. You could pop your needle in there as a location marker, and then you could count 2 stitches over. So there's 1 bound off stitch over, 2 bound off stitches over. Let me just move out so that you can see this better. Okay, so I'm going to start my pickup here, and we're using a smaller needle than we used for working the body part here. That's just going to be for the pickup, then we'll switch back to the regular size needle, but it'll make it a bit easier to do this pickup. So picking up from the bound off edge here, you can either do it by going under the V shape of the bound off stitch and counting it that way, or you can also just find the hole and be consistent about picking up where the hole is. I think for this, I am going to go into the hole. The other thing that I am focusing on as I pick up across here, because it can feel a little bit tricky knowing exactly, because we're picking up 1 for 1 across this bound off edge here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the upper bump of the garter ridge each time and count that as 1 stitch. So joining in the yarn, leaving a tail, and then pulling 1 stitch through. So now my next garter bump is here. So I'm just going to put the needle in right above that. And pick up my next stitch. And so on until I get to the end of the front neck bound off stitches. Then we have a few stitches here that are the sloped bias bind off. Then we get to the kind of the actual vertical part of the garter there. So I am now at those sloped bias bind off stitches. So you can see those ones they're a little looser looking and a little more stretched out. So in order to close up the gap a little bit, I'm not actually going to go into the larger hole that you can see, but instead I'm going to go into the garter sort of bump bit in between each of those holes. And that will just mean that the pickup will be a little tidier. So not into the big gap here, but into the garter bump in between. And here, there aren't very many of these ones. And then we are at the vertical part of just the plain garter here. So with garter stitch, you have a bump. You can see kind of like a bump at the edge and then a space or a more stretched out V in between each bump. So in the pattern, you're going to be instructed to pick up in every row. So that means picking up into a bump and into a space, if you like, between the bumps. And that will ensure that you have enough stitches picked up along this section. So just take your time doing that, finding the bump, and I just kind of find somewhere to go in the bump. I'm not being super exact about it. Then I'm going into the space. When I go into the space, I do have 2 strands of yarn over the needle. Space, then I'm finding the bump, and so on. The thing that I would emphasize is to have a secure looking pickup. So if you think something looks super gappy, just pick up an extra stitch in there if you can. You'll also pick up at the shoulder join to eliminate, you know, the gaps or the stretched out stitches there. You'll be picking up 1 for 1 across the back neck bound off stitches. So you'll do that the same way. Then you're going to move down the vertical part of the left front, picking up in every row. You'll have those bias bind off stitches again, and then we'll look at the final pickup along the front, because as I said, the front is going to overlap slightly, so we're actually going to come in behind our first picked up stitches here, right at the very end. But aim to get a clean pickup. If your stitch count is slightly off at the end of it, you'll be able to adjust that easily in the first round that you work. Okay, so now we are back to the center front, right where we started to pick up. And because I want these front parts to overlap slightly, I am going to go into these stitches behind the first ones picked up to create that overlapped look. So essentially I'm kind of going into the bound off stitch again, because it's now being pushed, that bound off edge is now being pushed to the wrong side of the work. So I am going to pick up behind for 4 stitches, and that will just give me a little overlap of the stitches. Might feel a little fiddly to do this. Just make sure, try and use a pointy-ish needle to bring that through. So do 1, 2, 3, and last one, 4. So now you can see those front edges are going to overlap each other. The hood is worked flat back and forth. Because of this funny overlap of stitches here. The first few rows will feel a little tight going back and forth this way, but once you move further up the hood, that will be okay. So if you have ended up with a different stitch count, then you'll just adjust on the next row. So here is the Hairst Hap Hood when it's finished. This is the hood part complete. When you work the hood, I showed you picking up the stitches around the neck here. So you'll work it up to a specified height, and then you divide the stitches in two that you have on the needle for the hood, and you're going to work short rows to work each side, the left and the right side of the hood, just to give it this shaping at the top. Also, whilst you are working the hood, you're going to be slipping stitches at the end of each side, so it gives it this kind of finished slip stitch all the way around the hood. So you can just leave it as is, or you can work an I-cord pick up and bind off around this neck opening. So I'm just going to show you how that part is done. You're going to start the pickup a few stitches above the start of the hood edges here, and that's because they overlap a little bit. So in order for the I-cord to kind of hang down comfortably, we're going to start picking up 3 stitches above the start on this first side, so you'll have the right side facing you. Okay, so here is our slip stitched edge, and you're going to count up 3 of these slipped stitch edge stitches and start picking up in the third one there. So I am literally just putting the needle straight through 2 bars of yarn there to do the pickup, and then I'm just going to join in some yarn and start picking up all the way around the edge of the hood. So you'll pick up 1 for 1 of these slip stitches, and you want to try and keep the pickup relatively loose feeling so as not to tighten up that opening too much. So you'll do this all the way around the hood. Okay, so when you've picked up all the way around the hood opening here, you'll stop on the second side. When you come down the second side, you're going to stop 3 into the third slip stitch on this side, just so that the pickup and ending point is at the same level here at the front of the hood, and then the ties will be hanging down from the same point there. You're going to break the yarn and just leave that as is, and then in the pattern you will be instructed to work a section of the first tie. So it's a little twisted right now because it hasn't been blocked or anything. I'm working a purled I-cord because I want to mimic the garter stitch that's in the rest of the hood here. You could do a regular I-cord if you prefer the look of that, but just so you see what this one looks like, it has the garter ridges on it here. So you work that to your preferred length first, then we're going to start to join it and bind off around these picked up stitches. So the first time that we join it, you'll begin the row the same way. So in this case, we're purling stitches, not knitting them. So the yarn is forward, so we'll do a purl 3. There are 4 stitches total on here. Then I'm going to slip this stitch temporarily over to my right hand needle so that I can start the setup for joining it to the hood. Okay, so here is the first time that I'm going to be joining it to the hood. I am going to slip this stitch that was on my right hand needle over to this left hand needle, and we are going to work the first purl two together, starting to join the I cord to the picked up hood stitches. So that's my first join, and it's going to be a little bit loose because I just have a tail of yarn behind there, but that can get tightened up later. The yarn gets moved to the back of the work. You're going to slip 4 stitches back over to the left hand needle. So I think this one got split. And then you'll continue to work your I cord bind off, purling 3, and then doing a purl 2 together. So purl 2 together again. So that's me joining the next picked up stitch around the hood with my I cord tie. So you'll just keep doing that all the way around the hood opening, and then when you get to the other end, you will then leave those picked up hood stitches and just be working a long section of the I cord on its own to match the same length as the start. So here is what that I cord looks like once it's all finished. We started with one side of the tail and then picked up all the way around the hood and then made another tail to match in length to the other side. So you can see it does pull in the front of the hood a little bit. So if you want a slightly snugger fit around the front, then that'd be a nice thing to do. You do want to make sure that you don't work this too tightly as you're going around there. Just keep an eye on that. And I've blocked this as well. So these ties kind of have a tendency to twist a bit when you're knitting them. So I actually just did a steam block with my iron on these because I'd already blocked the rest of the hap. And then an additional thing you can do if you are so inclined is to just add in a tiny little taste of some hap shell lace or old shell lace, which is traditionally seen on haps. So the bottom part of this hood is kind of worked like a modern method of making a hap, where you start with the center triangle. And let's just zoom in here again. Along the outside edges, as you were working those triangles, you made these little yarn over loops. So starting at one of the shoulder joins, if you're adding in the lace, what you'll be doing is picking up those yarn over loops down each side of the triangle. So it'll be 4 sides total because you're doing the front and the back. And you're just going to go in from front to back with your needle and pick up those loops first and place them on. So you'll just go in front to back for each one of those. And when you get to the points or a shoulder join, you'll be placing a marker there. So just make sure when you pick them up that you're placing them all from front to back. So you want to be consistent with that. And that means the left leg will be forward. And that's what you want it to look like. Okay, so when you've picked up around 4 sides of that lower triangular part of this project, you should have 46 picked up loops on each side. You might find that where the shoulder join is, or right at the point of the front and back triangle, you might need to dig around a little bit to find the yarn over loops there, but we're aiming for 46 down each side. And then you just want to put a different marker here to indicate the beginning of the round. And we're actually going to be purling stitches first. And I mentioned that all of these legs are on with the left leg forward, so they look kind of twisted on the needle. So we're going to be going into the front here as if to purl. So you'll just catch the yarn and leave a tail there that will get woven in later. and you're just going to knit around, sorry, purl around, not knit around, purl across all of these picked up loops. And you should see a kind of crisscrossed effect there from where they're being picked up. And that's what you want. Then once you get back around to the beginning of the round marker again, so you've done a whole purl row across those picked up yarn over loops, then the next row you're going to be increasing stitches across each section. So if you need to adjust your stitch count at all to get to the right number, then you'll do it on this next row. So I wanted to add in working the hap shell lace in this little edging part here. I didn't record that when I was actually working on it, so I am going to be showing you just on some stitches that I've cast on to a needle here. But after you have picked up around the sides of both triangles and put your markers in 4 locations there, and you've increased stitches as well, then you'll get to round 4 in this section, and that's where you start to work this old shell lace. And the pattern doesn't include a chart for this lace because you're just working it on this row, but I figured in case there's anybody knitting this who hasn't really done any lace before, it might be helpful just to have a quick overview of that lace. So I'm just going to move this out of the way for a second so that we can zoom in a little bit to the stitches on the needle here. So on round 4, you will start with a knit 1, so you'll have your beginning of the round marker on your right hand needle at this point. You'll be working in the round, so you begin with a knit 1, and then you work 3 knit 2 togethers side by side, 1, 2 and 3, and then you are going to work a yarn over and knit 1 5 times, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you'll make 1 more yarn over, but this time you're going to go straight into a slip slip knit, and you'll work that slip slip knit 2 more times, and that essentially is 1 repeat of this, let's see, old shell lace here. You can see these holes at the outside here are those yarn overs that are made, and so you'll repeat that on each of the 4 sections. It gets worked 3 times on each of the 4 sections, and then the next row you're basically just going to purl that row, then you're going to bind off all of your stitches. Because of wanting to be able to block a little bit of a curve into this edging, if you're working it, you need to make sure that you do a good stretchy bind off after you finish this lace. I like to use an Icelandic bind off, and I am going to show you how to work that next. Okay, so to work an Icelandic bind off, I often like to go up in needle size to just aid with it, making it a little stretchier. So that's something you could possibly do, is use 1 size up from the needle that you're working on to work this bind off. You're just kind of have to see how your tension is. If you want, you can use a different kind of bind off for this section. You just need it to be a good stretchy bind off so that you can block this. So to get started, you actually go ahead and just knit the first stitch normally, and then we're going to slip it back over to the left hand needle there, and then we begin the bind off by going into the first stitch on the needle as if to purl. We are now going to catch the second stitch on the needle as if to knit and make this X shape with it. Then you're going to wrap the yarn. You're going to bring that through the base of that X shape there and take it off the needle. So that's one stitch bound off. You'll slip this back over to the left-hand needle. So coming in as if to purl, scooping the second stitch as if to knit, and making this X shape here. Wrap the yarn and bring it through the base of the X shape, and then take it off the needle and slip it back over. So you just repeat that, and try to be careful not to do it too tightly. It can look a little, I don't know, untidy looking as you're first working it, but that will block out or stretch out just by kind of pulling on those stitches there. So this particular bind off, the Icelandic bind off, is a nice one to go with garter stitch. It blends in quite nicely because it creates these garter bumps as you're working it, and it's also a stretchy bind off.